Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. I hope you're all well. Today I'm going to show you how I painted the soft textured fur on this golden retriever dog using watercolour. I'll be experimenting with mixing Daniel Smith's buff titanium with the other colours on my granulating watercolours palette. But the fur techniques I use can be applied to whatever watercolours you have, so I hope you find it interesting or useful. I'm also going to be using Craftamo's eco-friendly bamboo brushes for the first time, and I'm really looking forward to sharing my first impressions with you. These I bought directly from Craftamo, but I will leave a link to their website in the description box if you're interested. I'll also leave a link to the reference photo from Pixabay and all the other supplies I use with an affiliate link to Jackson's art store if you fancy picking out any of them for yourself. Using the link will not incur any extra cost to you, but will earn me a small commission, and I really appreciate all your support. Now, before I start painting, I just want to take a moment to appreciate the beautiful presentation and look of these Craftamo brushes. There are 10 eco-friendly brushes in this set, which I think I paid around £45 for. And straight out of the box, I was struck by how lightweight this largest size 10 brush is. It feels really smooth and nice to hold, and it has a super fine looking point, which will be really useful for the details on my animal paintings. All of the brushes in this set are round and go down in size to the smallest, which is a size 3/0. I probably won't get to use all of the brushes today, but I'll let you know any thoughts on the ones I do use as we go through the painting. I was also interested to see that Craftamo recommend these brushes for any medium, not just watercolour, so if any of you have tried them out with other mediums, I'd love to know how you got on, so let me know in the comments box below. Anyway, let's get started on the painting. I've already got an accurate outline sketch down in my sketchbook, and at the top of the screen here you can see the little test paper where I experimented a bit with colour mixing prior to starting on the main piece. You don't have to do this, and it doesn't take long, but I think it helps to be prepared, especially if you're trying new paints or are new to colour mixing. And for those of you who may be wondering, I use the grid method to draw my accurate outline sketch onto regular printer paper, and then I use the reverse transfer method to get it onto my watercolour paper. Any extra details can then be added freehand just using a regular or mechanical pencil. Ideally, you want to keep this outline sketch as light as possible so it's not visible on the final painting, but I've left this quite dark today just so that you can see it on the video. So I'm starting with the background first and pre-wetting the whole area around the dog's head just with plain water. And I've gone for the largest of the brushes, the size 10. And these cruelty-free fibres really seem to hold a lot of water. So it didn't take too long at all to pre-wet the entire background. I'm going to be using the wet on wet technique to paint a soft out of focus background. So for this you're aiming for a nice even sheen of water all over the area of your paper you want to paint. Now I'm dropping in some green watercolour and letting it bleed across the surface of the paper. This is Roman Schmall's Aquarius green. I'm concentrating this around the outside of the painting to lead the viewer's eye inwards. And whilst the paper is still damp, I'm also dropping in some lighter green nearer the dog's face. I add some buff titanium too. The paper is still damp. Buff titanium contains a white pigment PW6:1, and I wanted to see how it mixed with the greens on the paper. I'm also going to be using it as a base layer for the dog's fur, so including it here not only adds a bit of interest to the background, but I'm hoping will help to unify the painting as a whole. Once that first background layer had dried, I re-wet it again and dropped in a lighter, brighter green this time. I mixed this using the Aquarius green again and a bit of lemon yellow. To create some of that bokeh out of focus look, I used a damp brush and a circular motion to lift out some lighter areas. And I have to say the brush coped really well with being squashed like this and sprung nicely back into place, no problem. Finally, I dropped in some of Schmincke's Tundra Blue just to complete the look. So that's all dry now, and I'm pretty happy with it, so I'm going to start on the dog's fur. I refer back to my mixing swatches to remind me. Like I said before, I wanted to use the buff titanium as a first base layer and use its granulating properties to help create a bit of texture in the fur. I also tried out mixing it with Tundra Orange for the darker areas of fur. This is another of Schmincke's Supergranulation colours, and one I've really enjoyed using in previous paintings. Here I'm mixing those two colours together to create a softer mid-tone, and that should be all I need for the first layer. I'm using the wet on wet technique again here, so applying wet paint onto pre-wet paper. This allows me to begin subtly mapping out the different sections of fur quickly and easily without having a hard edge form. This time though, rather than pre-wetting the whole of the dog's head with clean water, I wet one area at a time. You don't have to do this of course, but it gives you a bit more control. And I often find that if I wet the whole of my animal, that some areas of the paper will have dried before I get to them. So this way I don't have to rush. Painting a subject like this might at first glance be a bit overwhelming. But by breaking it up into smaller, more manageable sections and working in layers at a pace you are happy with, it's not as tricky as you might think. So at this stage I'm just concentrating on getting some paint on the paper and using my reference photo to help me with where the lightest and darkest areas of fur are. And although I'm not painting any fur detail in yet, I am already looking at the length and direction of fur growth and trying to match that with my brush strokes. On the ear, for example, the fur is longer and wavy, but around the mouth it's shorter and follows the contours of the face. Next I switch to a much smaller brush. This is a size 2. I'm going to use this to paint some of the details on the nose and eye. This brush, being one of the smaller ones, obviously holds less water, but when you're trying to paint small details, that's no bad thing in my opinion. It also has quite a firm and springy tip to it, but I found this helped me to make more precise and controlled marks. I really like it, and I think it would be great for beginners too. On both the nose and the eye, I started off with some Tundra Blue watercolour, as I often add blue to noses and eyes to make them look really shiny. The darkest details I painted using Tundra Violet. With that dry, I'm changing up to a slightly larger size 6 brush. I'm going to use this to glaze over more colour to the nose, and also start to build up the grey purpley tones I can see in the fur around the dog's mouth. This I paint onto dry paper. The dog's nose and eyes are the darkest parts of the painting. Painting these in fairly early on like this will enable me to more accurately paint in the midtones. So that's what I'm going to do next, starting on the face. Looking back at my reference photo, the fur on the face is very blonde, but I could also see soft pinks, purples and green shades within it too. To achieve these soft colours, I used the buff titanium again. This time though, rather than mixing the colours together on the palette, I'm going to let them mix together on the pre-wet paper. With all the watercolours on this palette being granulating colours, I'm hoping this will help to add interest and texture to the fur, as the different pigments separate out. So I first dropped in some buff titanium onto the damp paper, and here I'm loosely dropping in some of that Tundra pink. I did the same under the dog's eye. And then the brush strokes I'm using here, you can see I'm taking around the face and down the neck. By the ear here, where the fur is darker, I use some of that tundra pink onto the dry paper, just to start putting in some of that fur detail, and carving out some of the shapes that I can see within the fur. I'm not copying the reference photo exactly at this point, just using it as a rough guide. You don't need to copy each and every hair or clump of fur exactly to create a realistic looking painting, unless you want to of course, but it is important to get your values right. So with each layer I'm gradually increasing the tonal contrast to help add depth and realism to my painting. I've also left the top of the dog's head completely white to really help the portrait pop. And then to darken up the muzzle area, I used the tip of a size 6 brush to loosely tap in some V shapes, and this helped create a bit of fur separation. I continued using this wet on dry technique to darken up the fur under the dog's mouth, and used the same few colours as before, only a bit more concentrated. Here I'm using a mixture of buff titanium and tundra violet to paint a soft grey for the longer fur on the side of the dog's face and under the chin here. When painting wet on dry, the paper does dry quite quickly, but before I add any further layers or glazes to the face, I want to let it dry completely. And whilst that's happening, I can start to paint the wavy fur on the ear. The fur here is more of an orangey brown colour than on the face, so I start by painting some tundra orange onto wet paper. And whilst the paper is still damp, I add in more pigment, using longer wavy strokes with my brush. I continue to build up the colour like this just by using these long wavy brush strokes. And by keeping a lot of variety in the tones, was able to create the impression of depth and texture in the fur using just this tundra orange colour. It wasn't until right at the end that I mixed in some Mars brown and a bit of blue to get the darker values. This was a really quick way to paint wavy fur, and I just love the added texture you can get by using granulating colours. With my painting completely dry though, I can go ahead and add a few final details and finishing touches. I start by mixing buff titanium with the same Aquarius green I used in the background. I use this quite diluted to glaze over some of the fur on the neck. Often you get surrounding colours reflect back onto the subject, and I thought this softer green would do the trick. Next, I grab this old size 1 flat brush. I'm going to use this brush very dry to quickly paint on some darker fur detail around the muzzle area. For the dry brush technique to work, you need to load your paintbrush up with paint and then sop up the excess water on a paper towel. Then you simply use short flicking motions with your brush following the direction of fur growth. I continued to use this method to add darker fur all the way down the side of the dog's mouth, extending the length of my brush strokes where needed. All that's left to do now is to sharpen up a few details using a black and white coloured pencil, and paint the whiskers. For the whiskers, I decided to try Rowney's FW white acrylic ink, just because it's new to me and I haven't tried it before. I was intending on using one of the really small paintbrushes to apply it, but the point on these Craftamo brushes are so good that I thought I'd continue with the size 6. The advantage to using the larger size is that it'll hold more of the ink, so I'll be able to paint longer whiskers without keep having to reload my brush. And this combination seemed to work really well. So, all things considered, first impressions of Craftamo's eco-friendly bamboo brushes are very good. I really enjoyed them and they'll definitely be finding a permanent home on my desk. I also really enjoyed mixing softer granulating colours using buff titanium and the other colours on my granulating watercolours palette, and I absolutely loved painting this little guy. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a thumbs up, comment below if you have any questions, and don't forget to subscribe if you're not already. Thank you so much for watching, take care, have a great week, and I'll see you all in the next one. Bye!